We got that recording. Now we're going to start the audio. And there's not going to be too much behind the scenes for you folks watching from YouTube. So, just stay tuned. Yeah, I got a little company sitting in because she wants to see the podcast or later YouTube and blah blah blah. So, I am now entertaining. In fact, do you want me to get you in the picture? No? You sure?
No, I didn't.
You find us out. What you talking about? Alright, so let's get ready to do this. Good morning and welcome to Psych Talk with Sean, where we talk psychology and then some. I'm your host, Sean Hupel, and as promised, we are going to be talking about trauma. Plus, there's a little fun story that's going to be at the end of the show, so stay tuned. It's going to be in the last 15 minutes, and it's been building up, which is why I've been holding off on this episode for, well, probably a month or so. So let's start with the basics. What is trauma? Trauma is basically harm. So you can have physical trauma, you can have emotional trauma, but the long story short is trauma is some kind of damage. Now, trauma can be easily healed. Like, for example, if I throw a piece of paper at a wall, yeah, there was a tiny bit of molecular, atomic, or whatever trauma when that thing just lightly hit it. Kind of like how a drop in a cave can slowly carve out a little crevice so that it can escape the cave, but it takes a long time, right? So tiny bits of trauma right there. But then there's bigger traumas, and they leave scars. And what's funny is, when we look at physical trauma versus psychological trauma, the scars have a very similar healing effect, and a very similar scar effect. Meaning, once we get damaged on our skin, we get a little bit tougher, and we're more resistant. For example, if you break your bones, that's what Muay Thai is based on. They kick trees until their legs are broken enough times that they heal strong enough to knock down the tree instead of breaking their leg. And they do this over and over and over again. In karate, they do the same thing with punching and kicking and so on and so forth. And there are many other styles of martial arts. And as you know, I love martial arts because martial arts is full of psychology. But trauma is the reason that those Muay Thai fighters, when they get older, can't walk. And trauma is the reason that those karate masters have a hard time holding a glass or picking up chopsticks to hold rice. And the same thing happens with emotional trauma. These things build with us. So, for example, there's a bunch of different types of emotional trauma. So you can have the acute types of trauma, which are just the verbal jabs or the sequential consequences of an event. Or they could be gradual. To stay with the martial arts theme, there's a thing called death of a thousand cuts. And literally, you can cut somebody over and over and over again with small little paper cuts until they die. And it's an extreme form of torture. Well, imagine that emotionally. And that's what some people go through every single day. I myself have gone through a decent amount of trauma, and I'm not going to get into a sob story, nothing like that. But I know plenty of people that have been through trauma as well. And some through prolonged trauma. In fact, I recently found out from my mentor that an ex-girlfriend of mine, she is going through a decent amount of trauma with her relationship. And I kid you not, when I saw her child in church, when I was going back home to visit, I have never seen a more well-behaved child, and that set off every red flag in my body. Like, you don't see a child be that still for that long through a service. But trauma happens all the time. I mean, my mother, for example, she and her brothers were basically lined up by my grandfather and beat just to remind them that he was home. And he used those exact words, according to two uncles, my mother and my grandmother. Trauma is a real thing, and what happens, like, we know about physical scars and whatnot, like, you break bones and end up with arthritis, which I earned my arthritis, thank you. Both hands, and I've got a little bit in my left leg. I earned that. but I also lived a kind of a hard life when I was younger. But there are traumas that are exceptionally difficult to handle because we don't talk about them openly. Emotional trauma is a real thing. I'm autistic, and in the autism community, one of the biggest traumas that people are facing is we all know what it's like to be ignored, to be told, no, you don't feel that. No, you haven't gone through that. I mean, I'll give you a quick example that's going to lead up to the last 15 minutes, right? So, when I was basically homeless, living on my mother's couch, my mother came from a lifetime of trauma, and it goes on beyond childhood. And what ended up happening was she goes through depression like I do, meaning we get angry, we don't get sad. And that has a detrimental effect in how we handle it with other people around us. And I happen to be an easy target nowadays. I don't fight back like that, not to family, because family I care about. And when it came to the living situation, there was a lot of disregard. So, for example, I would wake up every morning for at least 6 months to sharp noises and bright lights, which literally hurt. But no one believed me. Same thing through childhood. That's a negligent trauma. Okay, it's more of an abandonment trauma, as well as just general disregard and disrespect. But then you've got other types of emotional trauma, such as my first client for tutoring. All right, he was my leasing agent, and he was struggling with college. He did 2 tours in Iraq. Really, really awesome, amazing guy, and what he's done with his career, and he was by far my best student. Seriously, 1.87 GPA when we started in his bachelor's degree, and he graduated magna cum laude. I could not be prouder of that man and his accomplishments. But part of that was the first year I spent trying to tell him that, no, dude, you're smart. Like, I've seen you react. I've seen you learn. And I'm over here coaching him. I'm teaching him the lessons, but he's grabbing them like, bam, every single time. And then by the end of the class, he's teaching me. And that was freaking cool. But it took years for him to realize, hey, I really am that smart. And that's because he told it to me himself, is that his family always told him he was dumb. And that has an effect. So let's grab another one, okay? Let's say we got the disregarding one and whatnot. Let's say the ones where you're actually attacking, where you actually get verbally attacked and they're trying to demoralize you. Okay, that is, I call it projected schadenfreude because there's not a psychological term for it that I'm familiar with. But basically you're engineering schadenfreude. You make somebody else feel diminished in order to feel better by proxy. And you get to externalize your feelings through projection. And that leads to, ultimately, trauma. Now, how does this trauma affect us? Okay, so we're all familiar with trauma because we've all been through it. It's a part of life. In fact, let's go a little bit further into the trauma of life and why it's necessary. So number one, I could not live a peaceful life. Like completely peaceful, placid, like, oh my gosh, we're on a lake, let's just boat out. I am way too adventurous for that. I'm not that dude that, to quote the metaphor that I was throwing out before, there was a guy in a tower that if he stayed in the tower, he could live forever. And then there's this guy on the ground that's going to basically be me in this story, because that's exactly what I would do. He walks up and he's having a conversation with this guy in the tower, and the guy in the tower says, I will live forever. And the guy looked up and said, is that really living? But what was the reason that man got up in the tower in the first place? Why did he want to live forever? Nobody really analyzes that metaphor or that story from that perspective, do they? Maybe that man suffered trauma, and he's become a recluse. That happens a lot. Physical trauma on somebody that is done through a state of anger, that leaves scars. Whether it's to a child or to an adult, that leaves harm. And that harm can be interpreted by us a couple different ways. So we can do the projection route. That's what I described to you a little bit earlier, where you basically externalize your anger or your depression as anger. But then you've got the other trauma, which is negligence. You can disregard somebody. For example, when I'm going to throw another one out there from my own personal life that you've heard in a previous episode, but maybe you guys are new. And by the way, if you want to catch up to old episodes on YouTube, my handle is Autistic Commando. And if you want to catch me on Twitter, it's Adornus, Eadornus. But in a previous episode, I talked about cumulative traumas. Okay, so basically, my closet when I was homeless living on my mother's couch has a literal 30-year-old video game tester. Okay, look up the credits. It's Xperis Game Tester. You'll find my name in Crackdown 3 and State of Decay 2, both of which are pretty awesome games, by the way. Thanks to partly yours truly. If the juggernauts keep chasing you, you can thank me. But that is, as fun as I try to make it, my closet was the front door. Or the closet by the front door, like where you hang your coats and stuff. That was my closet. And so you would open it up, and the way that you opened it up, it acted like a screen. So like it was blocking me from family, and it got the front door closed, and it's just like, oh my gosh, I can change my pants and go to an interview. Yay! But that wasn't the case. A couple times my mother wanted some air, and without even thinking about me, I wasn't even a second thought. She walks up, opens the door, and I challenged her on it the first 3 times because the second and third time, the neighbor's kids saw me and I saw them in my boxers. That's humiliating. It was negligence and disregard. And imagine a lifetime of that. Sounds almost like death of 1,000 cuts, doesn't it? But it's not just one person. It can also be a lot of people, because once we go through trauma, the more trauma we go through, the more other people can see it externally. They can see who we are. They can see our pain. And unfortunately, there are some people that don't like, they don't like the smile on some people's faces because they've got harm of their own. I haven't met a single person without trauma, without challenge, without pain. And that can build up over time, but let's go back to high school, okay? Because a lot of autists can relate to this one. Being teased, being bullied for being a little bit different. My mentor is Dr. Eugene Satterwhite of Shekinah Glory. And he holds a doctorate in theology, but he also won a landmark civil rights case where he was one of 4 people to go against an employer that said, no, you're not going to get this new job even though, according to our rules, you've earned it. He won. He also reopened the prison ministries in Washington State, and he can preach at every tribe along the West Coast and throughout Canada, all the way to Quebec. And he don't even speak French. But he is the biggest teddy bear you'll ever see in your life. And I mean, his wife just retired. Like, you have no idea how excited I am for them to go on this new journey of their life, because she just retired from being a nurse for 40 years. Frontline worker. I mean, she was taking care of long-term care people. But I'm excited for them. But going back to story, he was one of my earlier introductions to racial profiling. And that is a form of trauma too. Talk to the Native Americans. They know all about that. And recently, you've got Chinese folks. I mean, I remember 9/11. My buddy Tamar, he was the brother of my best friend at the time, Chris. And he was bragging about beating up somebody that he called in Afghanistan. Like, he was just so disregarding and so projecting of hate, but now he had an excuse. And that's part of how trauma forwards is we want other people to feel what we feel so that we can feel better about ourselves by proxy. We see them diminished, and so we feel a little bit better about ourselves. But it's still empty. Because I've been that guy. I have been that a-hole. I have, my 20s were rough. Let me tell you something. But that's because my teens were rough. My elementary was rough. I'm autistic, and I didn't learn how to hide amongst all of you until I was about 14, 15. And part of it had to do with my mentor, Dr. Satterwhite. And you know what's funny? As traumas build up over time, it changes our perspective on life too. It makes us guarded. So think about it this way. Let's say, you ever seen a dog, when you're trying to pet them, they pull back? Or you ever seen a dog that just looks like they've been through trauma? Like their owner hasn't treated him right in the past? Dogs are innocent. Human beings are innocent. We are born that way. We are taught hatred. We are taught anger. We are taught to discriminate. Because somewhere along the line, somebody felt hurt and decided, I'm going to take this out on somebody else. And then they had babies. And these values that get instilled into the next generation, they're all based out of trauma, if we trace it back onto pathology. But there's healthy trauma too. Like, for example, as I said, I couldn't be that guy in the tower. I need some stress in my life. We all do. And we have what's called a stress tolerance. So we're going to use the steel analogy on this one, because we all have stress tolerance, physically, mentally, boom. And it's different because we're all made of different metal. So with steel, you hit it once, ding, okay, maybe you damaged a few atoms, right? Like, what's your fist going to do? But then you hit it with something harder, and you keep hitting it, and slowly the metal bends. Now, if you look at where the metal's bending, you can see where it's bending inward, it's folding over itself, and where it's bending outward, there's some microfractures starting to form. Now, if you hit it a little bit more and a little bit more, you can eventually bend it, but now it's in a different shape. And those microfractures, when you bend it back to its normal shape, it's a hard process to bend it back. It's a hard process because, well, I'm not going to go into the physics of steel because right now we're on an analogy, metaphor. Yay! Yeah, you're seeing the autism come out of me. But as that metal bends, it doesn't want to bend. When it first starts to bend, that's when you're exceeding its natural stress tolerance, right? But then let's say you keep bending it and keep bending it and keep bending it. You're going to cause microfractures. In fact, you want to see a perfect example of this? Get a paper clip. All right, take that thing, just bend it up, bend it down, bend it up, bend it down, bend it up, bend it. Dang, it broke, didn't it? We've all done it. We've all been kids doing that stuff. And that's when you exceed the stress tolerance of the metal. If you take that steel that's bending and whatnot and you hit it hard enough, you will fracture and break that steel. Everybody has tolerance to stress that's different, and we can adapt to become stronger. But in becoming stronger, to make steel, you have to take iron and you have to smelt it. You have to get rid of the impurities. You have to put it through the frickin' fire. And we're talking some serious heat. If you fell in, you wouldn't even know you hit. You'd be dead before you got there. Unless you went feet first, which I don't recommend. Well, I don't recommend taking a bath in metal, you know. I mean, I guess to each their own, you know, free country. But at the same time, ooh. But when you have that metal, you do have fractures. And if you can put it through steel, if you can make it go through the fire, it'll come out stronger, but you got to get rid of the impurities. And the impurities are the traumas from the past. Because you can reshape it, but it will never be the original metal it was. That iron, you can heat it up and turn it into steel. Or you can try and keep it iron, but it's going to become more brittle with time. It's going to wear with time. That's corrosion. If you want to get to steel, you got to get rid of the impurities. The impurities are what cause corrosion. And that's what eventually eats iron until it becomes rust. It becomes infected by the world, infected by oxidation. And now, oxidation from an emotional standpoint is when you've got people reinforcing the same type of trauma, and we call that clique mentality. I've talked about the alpha-beta complex before, and in the alpha-beta complex, pretty much you've got betas pretty much taking over the world. I mean, they invented capitalism, they invented society. I am fully convinced of that one. But the reason that betas succeed so much is they seek out their own self-interest. And the events of trauma, their own self-interest is to feel, better than the other person. Because once you feel better than the other person, like when they're disenfranchised, then even though there's 7 billion people on this frigging planet, that one person being diminished makes you feel better by proxy. It's not going to change your future. It's you externalizing your own internal emotions to gain a sense of gratification through superiority. Or at least that's the best pathology I've been able to trace when I try to trace it to like the core motivation. Because motivation is the key to everything. And our motivations change through trauma. They change through time. Because trauma teaches us conditioning. So what are you doing with steel when you're bending it and whatnot? You're conditioning the steel. Or the iron. And steel can still break. It's stronger than iron. But it can still break through trauma. And so as you condition the steel, as you temper it, you can turn steel into one heck of a sword. Or you can turn it into a hammer. Or you can turn it into a shovel. Shovels are used to build. Swords are used to kill. Hammers are used to piece things together. We can choose what we ultimately become, but we have to go through getting rid of the impurities. And the impurities are anger, resentment, holding on to those previous traumas. But that doesn't make sense. Like, okay, trauma happened, right? How do you get rid of them? How do you smelter yourself and refine yourself from iron into steel? And that's where the hard part comes in, and that's why we have an entire profession surrounding it. Psychologist therapy. Now, one thing I prefer in a pastor is I prefer a pastor that's done more dirt in his life than me. Unfortunately, we don't always have that option with psychologists. And unfortunately, too, in psychology, I've known plenty of therapists, so that means master's degree, and actual psychologists, which means doctorate's degree. They're indoctrinated. But there's no passion behind them. Several of them took it on because they needed to do something with their life, and they wanted to make some money, so they got into therapy because one of them said it was easy. Like, no. You're taking on the responsibility for helping somebody with their life to get over trauma. Because many of us have scars. Even steel, when you bend it and hit it enough, it has scars. So what do you have to do to get over that? So the whole prerogative of a therapist is to ask questions, probing questions. And the reason they do that is to get people to confront what it was that caused them harm. Because we run from it. We suppress it. We compensate for it. Compensation is a huge thing. But we do things to make ourselves feel better. In fact, in the autistic community, there's a thing referred to as stimming, but we do it all the time, just regular folks all around. And stimming is kind of like, for example, for a while I used nicotine to slow myself down. Because that's the whole reason Ritalin worked, right? Ritalin sped them up, which forced their brain to slow them down. Same thing with me. It helped me be functional throughout a 12 to 14-hour day. But it's also harmful over time, too. You can bend steel with heat, but eventually you won't be able to bend that steel properly. It's going to become weaker over time as you keep bending it and remolding it, reconditioning it. Our lifetime can definitely condition us. It can change who we become and how we perceive things. So let's say that dog analogy that I was throwing at you earlier. You can tell when dogs have been hurt because they give you all sorts of body language. And we do the same thing. And in that body language, we show people through micro expressions, which are universal, and through different behaviors, what we've been through. And people can interpret that according to their motivations. Some people are honorable about it, some people aren't. I feel absolutely blessed to be surrounded by people that are honorable, because I needed that. Trauma can be built up over a lifetime, and it's never fully healed. I mean, no matter how much you get used to this thing happening or that thing happening, people doing it this way, as much as you can get used to something, you are still guarded against it. You're still worried about it. And I spent most of my life worried about what other people think, what other people are doing. And I know so many people just like me. And so many people have been through so many different scenarios that I couldn't imagine. And I've also seen my mentor. I'm not going to tell his story, but if you ever want to find out, go to Amazon and look up Good Grief for the Hurting Heart. There are therapy offices that take it on. Because I know that man's story. I'm not going to tell it here because it's not mine to tell. But if you want to know what a true man of God looks like, Dr. Eugene Satterwhite. The book is called Good Grief for the Hurting Heart. That man has had more reason to walk away from his faith than anybody I've ever heard of still alive. But he kept to it. And you see, that's one of the beautiful things about recovering from trauma is you can have an anchor. And that's usually what we need. Your therapist can be your anchor that you can talk to and be honest with. Some of us, it's a friend. Some of us, it's a lover. It could be a complete stranger that changes your day on your worst day. I've had that. I've had that. And those amazing kindnesses can be an absolute beacon for somebody that's been traumatized and has developed an expectation of harm or an expectation of conflict. When a person goes to war, they have to change their mindset in order to survive. Survival is at the center of poverty and at the center of, well, pretty much poverty. Because if you look at any of those foreign countries with wars, there's a lot to do with money and or survival. It's about quality of life. Because nobody just wants to be alive. We want to live. We don't want to be that guy in the tower just existing. And that's the whole concept of freedom. It's why America booned freedom in a time when freedom was at jeopardy. And people endured trauma and they survived, but the people who went to war came back damaged. There's a thing called moral wounds, where you do things that conflict with your personality. In fact, that's why I stepped away from a previous career in marketing, branding, and we'll say consulting. And yeah, consulting's a good word. I stepped away from it because I didn't like the clients I was serving. I never did anything bad myself. I never did anything illegal. I never encouraged anything illegal. But there is a really gray fine line, and people paid me to find it. Or to basically get a competitor out of the way without getting them out of the way. You know, like mob style, like, I'm not that dude. But even so, I knew what these guys were doing. I never did dirt myself, but I knew it. And there were moral wounds with that. But there are also different types of moral wounds too. Like, for example, I truly regret not spending more time with my dog Turku. Seriously, he was the sweetest little dog. I mean, he literally saved a ferret, which it later became known as Blue, and had a sibling. And he also tried to save actual bunnies after my father bulldozed over their nest. And, of course, the parent ran away, and he saved one of them. The other two were already gone, and we tried to nurse him up, but, the little bunny didn't want to make it. But I feel bad about neglecting my dog. But that's also my character, my nature. That dog was family. We called him Prince Turku, and he was descended of a royal line that originated in Turku, Alaska. And I wasn't the one that named him, it was my grams. You know that lady who almost became a nun that I tell you guys about? She was my moral compass when I was a kid. She very much had an influence in how I came out ultimately. Because I am a kind person. And you'll find with kind people, kindness invites vulnerability. And it extends vulnerability. But being vulnerable puts you at risk to basically experiencing trauma if the other person is not a good actor. Give me 1 second, I'm going to grab some water. See, I'm not doing coffee today because it's actually nighttime. And believe it or not, coffee would put me down because I'm functionally autistic and it's a stimulant. But I'm also getting away from stimming because sometimes when soldiers went to war, they would compensate for going to war with drinking, or in some cases it was drugs. In fact, in ancient martial arts, if some of the legends I've read are true, there were, basically performance drugs. I mean, you've ever heard of drunken boxing? Being drunk is kind of like a chemical way of engineering shaori. And shaori, it's a colloquial term, but it's also useful, especially with the show Baki on Netflix. Just watch the show Baki on Netflix. It's not built for kids in any way, shape, or form. Okay, it's definitely not. But it's a wonderful show if you like martial arts. And it's based on real martial arts, but at the same time, it's exaggerated. Deeply exaggerated, like almost Simpsons level exaggerated. But these drunken kung fu masters would drink in order to relax their bodies. That's why drunks, when they get into car accidents, that the drunk survives, because they're relaxed. And that's the whole basis for shaori. That's the whole basis for Tai Chi. It's the basis for a lot of meditations. Relaxation. When they say let go of trauma, that's not easy when you're conditioned. When you walk into a room expecting a fight every time. Or you walk into a scenario expecting conflict, or to be demeaned, or to be humiliated. Human beings can be very cruel. And sometimes the biggest wounds come from the closest people to you. Because they're the ones that can do it. I mean, out here on the street, any one of you could say some really damaging things, and it won't do a single thing to me. But when it comes to people I care about, they know where to hit. And so these people who have been through trauma, these people who are close to you, these family members, or friends, or people you trusted, let me phrase it this way. A person's bad day is about them, not you. And when people are going through it, projecting is natural if we don't face our demons. You know what, we're only 34 minutes in, but I'm going to reveal what I've been doing for the past 6 months, because I think this is going to help somebody. See, again, autistic, and I was that dude that got up in front of 1,300 students and now singing the national anthem, Sean Hubel. And I cracked in front of those students, and then I cussed into the mic, and then you saw the principal and vice principal looking at each other like, do we pull them off? And so I finished in falsetto. And no joke, the next day, three dudes that were, well, let's just say I literally sang my way out of a beatdown. Like, that happened. And when I was getting up to sing, you heard gasps around the crowd because I was that awkward up until that point, right? That left trauma on me. And that's one of many, many traumas. My parents never knew I could sing until they actually caught me one day, because I would sing in secret because I didn't want to have somebody critique what I love. I love to sing. And I didn't want somebody to ruin that for me. And so I kept it from them. And then when they did find out, I told them, don't come to my concerts. I didn't want them to come until I was good. And then, by 10th grade, I could blow. Let me tell you something. I had some serious range and quality and all of that. I kind of regret, well, I don't regret joining the Marines. I don't. I miss my voice, my good voice. Can't really get back to all those octaves I used to have, but I practiced every day for years at the perfect time in my life and development, vocal cord development, and I got some serious range. But the physical trauma of yelling in the Marine Corps, that caught up. The emotional trauma of being berated or not believed caught up. And so for the past 6 months, 6 months ago, I suffered a pretty significant loss, and it hurt me to my core. On top of that, that loss was greatly encouraged when I finally broke, meaning I had been worn down and worn down and worn down until I started projecting. It took 3.5 years. And that's on top of the lifetime. I was kicked out at 18, and I mean, geez, since I was a kid and so on and so forth. Like, I've had a rough life. And that leaves trauma. And the more you move, because there was this one lady that, I mentioned this in, I think, the first episode 1. But, yeah, there was this lady I met on a bus. I think it was a Greyhound. And I saw her and I'm like, you could tell when somebody's been through it. And I realized she's been through more than me. And I was in my 20s. But it was my mid to late 20s. So I'd already been through a decent amount. And I heard her conversation with a friend talking about making moves here, making moves there, and so on and so forth. And so I had a conversation with her, and I asked, after, building trust and whatnot, because I don't want to be that one weird dude that walks up like, oh my god, you look like you've been through trauma. Tell me about it. Like, I'm not going to be that dude. But we developed a little bit of rapport for a few minutes, and we had a good long conversation. And I was asking her, why do you keep pushing through? Like, I just heard 10 minutes of stuff I never want to go through. Like, why do you keep pushing through? And she says she basically summarized not wanting to be the guy in the tower. But the more you move, the more you're going to encounter. And then it hit to me as like, wow, I'm always trying to move. I'm always trying to build. I've been trying to grow and to get out of survival mode since I was 18 and kicked out. But I didn't have the skills or the tools to know how to do that, so I had to learn on the fly as an adult. And that doesn't always work out well. I mean, eventually, yeah, but in the short term. So with family trauma and all of that, my brother's selling my truck and so much. What I decided to do 6 months ago was face my demons. These things were controlling me. They were stopping me from building relationships. They were stopping me from being who I am. I was walking around with fear. Now, I've taken on dudes that are much, much bigger than me. It's not that type of fear. It's the apprehension of being demoralized, of being humiliated, of being challenged. I don't like conflict. And you'll find that the people most capable of war are the ones advocating the most for peace. And I'm very much a peacemaker. But I have moral wounds just like those soldiers who went off to war and had to survive by killing other people. Those drone pilots that knew they were dropping bombs on human beings. Those were moral wounds. When I wasn't a great person, those were moral wounds, and they caused trauma. So you got a lifetime of things coming against me and things coming against things I'm doing to myself. Because you better believe I was a masochist at one point, at least emotionally masochistic. But that's what happens when there was a phrase I read on Facebook that says, when parents don't value their children, the children grow up to learn not to value themselves. And so my 20s were lived under the philosophy of YOLO. I've mentioned this. But I'm not going to make this a sob story. I'm going to make this a story of success. Because for the past 6 months, in facing my demons, I actually went through that on YouTube. Like, if you want to see the full evolution, go to YouTube, Autistic Commando. I document it. And there's probably 4 times as many videos that I keep private. Because I didn't have access to a therapist. I was in a toxic situation, and I finally got free to where I can explore my own way of self-healing. So I started talking to myself. When you have no one else to talk to, you either talk to yourself or the world. And I told you before, I don't do just one thing at a time. So I talk to myself and the world. I documented my process of healing. And then I moved on to being my own therapist. I told you I love psychology. And being my own therapist, that was the only way you can be your own therapist is to ask yourself the hard questions and then to analyze the answer. And that's what the last 6 months of my life had been. When you speak to a therapist, you're blunt. Like when you develop that trust, you're blunt. And in that bluntness, it becomes a lot more familiar to be able to open up to that new person, that person you hadn't seen for a week. And you want to tell them about that week. And you want to express your emotions. You want to get yourself out. You want to be heard. That's the biggest challenge in the autistic community, is wanting to be heard. But we're not the only ones. Number one, Black Lives Matter. And I will stand by that until my dying breath. Or until America grows up and realizes where we came from. I mean, we're a country built on diversity because our diversity gave us strength. But here we are, a country of people that have been damaged, that are projecting their own depression, their own anger, their own insecurities onto other people. And I'm not going to touch back on the alpha-beta complex. I'm going to touch back on my story. So I've been making these videos where I express myself. Like, I treat myself and YouTube like a therapist. And there are a lot of videos you guys will never see. But in doing that, and going back to watch those videos, hearing myself really say what's on my mind about this topic or that topic, I was able to ask myself the questions. It was hard to become dispassionate, to take yourself and those emotions out of what you're watching. That was very difficult, probably the second hardest part of the process. The hardest part was actually saying it in the first place. I'm going to pause for a minute and get some water and some coffee, because I think right now is about coffee time. So, and to you folks on YouTube catching the inside look, I am going to get some coffee and pause this. Oh. Yay! Okay, we're gonna get back into it. I just need a breather for a second. Now to dive back into my amazing process. Seriously though, just between you and me, YouTube. Doing self-therapy, that's not an easy task. I have cried more in the past 6 months than I have in the rest of my entire life. And I have gone through physical pain, I've gone through emotional pain, I've gone through some serious loss. And the past 6 months of just facing everything has been a long, drawn-out process. Really long, drawn-out process. And every second of it, like here's the part that I may include in the radio show. I'll decide in like a few seconds when I get started, but when I talk about anything, every second of every day I'm visualizing. So I have to relive those memories that I'm going through as if I were there. And I'm hesitant to even say that because being autistic is to not be believed. That's the stereotype with us within the community. You know what, sob story aside, let's get back to it. Money. I'm not making any money off this though. What am I doing with my life? So, I just took a quick breather. But when it comes to self-therapy, number one, I do not recommend that. If I hadn't been studying psychology for the past, 20 plus years, like I'm obsessed with psychology, always have been, ever since 12, when I learned what the word was. So, and I didn't have access to a therapist, and I knew I had trauma. I knew I had stuff built up and causing problems in my life because my behavior was altered. I was constantly compensating for the threat I thought was coming. I was conditioned by the trauma. All sorts of trauma. And so I went through an exploratory process of feeling myself out at first. Where are my thoughts at? Am I comfortable enough to really open up? Because opening up, especially in front of a camera and then analyzing yourself, that's rough. Like, opening up in the first place is rough. And then having to sit back and analyze yourself, that's rough. Because we always want to have a bias. Our ego wants us to be right. But sometimes we're not. And when you go in to doing what I just did for the past 6 months, you're facing your ego left and right. Because your ego wants to say it's right. It wants to compensate for us in order to make us feel better. And our ego is also the cause for schadenfreude. That's where we like to see somebody disenfranchised or down and whatnot, and we get a sense of pleasure from it. So, a projected or engineered schadenfreude, that's a normal thing. We call it bullying. So I had to relive everything. A lifetime of trauma. And I did that in 6 months. Because there's a reason I joined the Marines. There's a reason I like martial arts. I'm not a pushover. I didn't like the fact that I was walking through life as if I were. So I faced those suckers. I faced them head on. And I wasn't allowed any sort of compensating tools. I didn't get the chance to stim or to do anything to compensate for it because that would defeat the purpose. Think about it this way. In fact, this would be a really good analogy because we're in summertime and you can actually try it. I don't recommend it. But I like to walk barefoot everywhere. I used to run with my dog over the gravel barefoot, and it was sharp. But walk outside after, like in the middle of the day when it's hot and sunny, and walk out barefoot. on the street, on the asphalt. Your foot's going to get burned. You can develop calluses over time. You can become used to getting your foot burned. But once you feel that heat, you're going to be conditioned for it. And in that conditioning, you're going to realize, man, I don't want to walk out barefoot anymore. But what if you have to get to the mailbox and you don't have shoes? Because you're homeless. I'm using the metaphor pretty strongly right now, but you get the idea. Sometimes you just have to compensate because there's a need to survive. But in facing your own traumas, you have to be honest. And that was a very, very long journey. I'll give you an example. In December, I have medical records showing me weighing at 207 pounds. Right now I weigh 162. And I've only started really eating again in the past 2 months because going through that kind of trauma, it causes depression. It can cause you to not want to eat, not want to get up. I mean, it amplifies your depression. But I went through it because even in regular therapy, you're going to have to go through it. It's just more gradual than what I did. And it's something I needed to do to get back to being me. Because once you face your traumas, once you are honest with yourself, when you're honest with the events, you're not blowing things out of proportion, you're not compensating by saying, well, I had to do it because of it. Like when you're completely honest with yourself, you can realize exactly who you are. And that's been the last 6 months of my life. In fact, I reached pretty darn close to rock bottom. Like, I thought I knew what rock bottom was about 5 years ago. Nope, not even close. But sometimes you have to, like when they say reaching rock bottom, the reason rock bottom works is because you don't have any more excuses down there. There's nothing else to say, well, what about, like, if you're at rock bottom, the only person you're responsible for and to is you. All the trauma in the world can build up on you, but you've got the choice on whether you want to hold on to that trauma and take pleasure in being the victim, which there's a term for it. I just can't recall off the top of my head. And don't get me wrong, I'm not going to look it up, just because I kind of want to get through this episode as much as I'm sure some of you want to. But if you want to take care of your problems, like therapist or no therapist, you got to be honest to yourself and to your character. Because originally, we were all innocent. It took the traumas of life affecting the people that taught us, or traumas affecting us, to change our behavior. And I mean, I really don't like B.F. Skinner, but he was onto something back in the 1930s. It's really, really outdated, but he laid the foundation for behavioral analysis. And applied behavioral analysis, I hate that. It's outdated, it's reckless, it's damaging. I don't like it in any way, shape, or form, and no psychologist should. Not if they have any respect for themselves. But then again, as I've said before, there are psychologists that get in for the money and not because they're passionate about it. I need to take a drink. I faced all those traumas because I knew I could endure it. And that's my stress tolerance. I've been through the ringer so many times in my life that I don't know if there's anything I can't overcome. But then again, the second you say that, life is funny, isn't it? But we can be the cause of other people's trauma through extension of our own until we figure out who we are. We're born innocent, and then we develop our personalities. Some are adventurous like me, some are quiet and reserved. And some, they out there like, whoa, why are you wearing that? It's my fashion. All right, do you? Whatever. Excuse me, I dropped something. But that's also another factor is do you, right? When people have gone through trauma and they're projecting their trauma, that's when applied behavioral analysis really fails, like really fails. I mean, if I could go back, I would. B.F. Skinner, he had his day. He needs to go away. But in our traumas, we can find ourselves. But our traumas can also shape us if we don't face them honestly. Sometimes we're at fault. Sometimes they're at fault. But if you don't take care of those, if we don't face our traumas, then we become slaves to them and it will change our behavior. Those scars, they add up. And yeah, they can be debilitating over time if we don't handle them. But we have the choice to either remain iron and let oxidation kick in and all of a sudden we start rusting until one of these days, Big O or whatever that, robot was from that 3D animated movie or whatnot, like his leg fell off because, oh, I'm rusted. Like we can be that person. We can slowly fall apart. In fact, it's called a nervous breakdown when you completely fall apart mentally. Or we can become steel. But steel has to go through the fire. And the last 6 months I've been going through the fire. That's a very doable thing. I highly recommend if you're feeling depression or let's say you're always angry, right? If you're always angry, that is a clear indicator of depression. I suffer from PTSD. I mean, I lived in Southside Chicago. Come on. As a white boy, like that's a real thing. Like that is a rough town. Make no mistake, that's a rough town. But it's also a sweet town, and there are people there that, even though they've been through trauma. Hardy Evans, I will mention him freely because he was my saving grace. He met somebody in church, and then, hearing his situation, he took a leap of faith and introduced me to Mr. Bell, who rented me a loft. Sight unseen, I didn't have to pay rent for the first 2 months, but you better believe I paid that man because that's my character. That's who I am. And in going through all those traumas, I've found some amazing grace, and I've granted some amazing grace to other people. Amazing grace is when you do something extraordinary for them. It's something extraordinary to them because they had a need, and you met it. It's the basis for pretty much every religion out there. Being nice to other people. If they say they're hungry, feed them, but also teach them how to fish. And that's what Dr. Satterwhite did for me. That's what Hardy did for me. That's what Mr. Bell did for me. And so many other people throughout my life. I will never claim to have made it here on my own. But I also know who I am because I faced my traumas and my past honestly. And that was the last 6 months of my life. And I'll say all that to say, number one, don't do it to yourself. Like, seriously, kids, don't try this at home. But go see a therapist if you find yourself constantly angry or constantly sad. Or at home, you want to do something, but you just have no energy to do it. Trauma is a very real thing in the United States. Extraordinary. Or extraordinarily. And I've never met anyone, well, actually, I've met a couple, but they're rare, without any serious trauma in their life. But poverty and need predicate trauma in a lot of ways. Because when you're in need, I mean, you're surviving, right? So it's either you or them. And that's a tough decision that can inflict moral wounds. Moral wounds are very serious. And they can cause prolonged trauma that alters our behavior. That's why people come back with PTSD and can take out those symptoms on their loved ones. Facing your traumas is very, very necessary in order to gain what Maslow's hierarchy refers to as self-actualization. That's where you're doing what you love for a living, which means you're living within your stress tolerance, but you're also meeting your stress tolerance and living. But Maslow's hierarchy is, I'm fully convinced that it cannot fully be achieved if somebody still suffers from the scars of trauma. Because if you're suffering from the scars of trauma, you're not really yourself anymore. You're compensating and you're preparing for the next fight or the next trauma. Because lifetime has conditioned us. But there is a saving grace. Okay, cool fact. On TikTok, Autistic Commando, that's me too. But I was talking about, in one case, how the Bible basically teaches you how to be an alpha. Even if you're a beta, you can become a pseudo-alpha. All you got to do is follow the 10 Commandments. Ultimately, and if you want to follow the New Testament, you just got to be nice to other people. And if we start being nice to each other, man, that's a bright future. In fact, I've said since I figured it out, I think 18 years old, the best relationship is where both people are trying to make the other person happy, going out of their way to make them happy, going out of their way to make them feel needed, wanted, desired, safe. If we go out of our way to be nice to other people, we can make a huge difference in this world. And I think in making that difference, just one person at a time, if we start to pay it forward, we can really make an impact. But it starts with the first kindness, letting somebody in when they're trying to drive next to you, or maybe letting them cut you in line or something like that, you know. Small kindnesses, holding a door. Those things add up. The same way that small scars, like berating words and whatnot, those add up too. But I found in this long journey that being kind to other people is definitely affording to my nature. In the same way that there are moral wounds, you can also have moral benefits, where you feel good for helping somebody else. So number one, get vaccinated. The vaccines are out there. They're freely available. Again, Autistic Commando YouTube. Twitter is Adornus, Eadornus. All of you go out there and have yourselves an amazing weekend. I'm going to see you back here on 98.3 in Salem, 8:30 in the morning on Saturdays. Y'all stay safe, and if you're not vaccinated, please wear a mask. And that was the show, folks.